I was a physician in this community for nearly 50 years. And I was the one who established the hospital in Calais in 1917. Now that was 100 years ago, and it was a time when you might recall Woodrow Wilson, oh you wouldn't, recall Woodrow Wilson was president, and he was talking about establishing a League of Nations. And let me think, the United States was getting ready to go to war in Europe to help those folks out. Right here in Maine, women got the right to vote that year. And I was, myself, thinking strongly that Calais needed a hospital all its own. Now it was 100 years ago, so you're going to have to forgive me. I prepared some remarks so I won't make mistakes. While I was waiting, I had a little fortification. I was born in New Brunswick in 1872. I went to school in my hometown, and I was fortunate enough to attend college. Graduated from the normal school in Fredericton. I even taught there for a while, but teaching wasn't for me, so I began to consider a career in medicine. I enrolled in the Baltimore Medical School and graduated, then took an advanced course at Johns Hopkins University. And from there, I went to London, England, and worked in Guy's Hospital for a period, and then on to the University of Edinburgh for more study. So I was well prepared for my profession. When I returned home from England, I came to Calais. There was a need for a doctor here at that time, and so I seized the opportunity and began my practice here. I came to town with little more than my knowledge of medicine and my young wife, and began visiting patients with a horse and buggy. It was 1899, and I had patients on both sides of the St. Croix River, as was common at that time. Well, after I'd been practicing medicine for 15 years, it became apparent more and more that the community of this size really needed a hospital of its own. There were advances in medicine that needed a hospital in order to be provided, and after much thought, I came to the conclusion that if I didn't take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and do it myself, it wouldn't be done. So I began to look for a place to establish my hospital. In those days, hospitals in small New England towns and cities were often located in a converted house. So I started looking at every house that came up for sale. I had visited hospitals in other cities and towns, so I had a pretty good idea of what I needed. Now I want to make one thing clear though. I did not establish the Calais Hospital as a private hospital, as was common at the time. I owned it, that's true, but it was open and for use by any registered physician, and I never intended it to make a profit, only to break even if I could. It was my idea as much as possible to provide a place for doctors to work and practice up-to-date medicine, and where patients could receive the necessary care. I was able to purchase the old McNichol house on Church Street. It was a big house with lots of rooms and seemed perfect for what I wanted. Mrs. McNichol was a widow, and she had closed up the house, and she and her daughter Helen had been living in Boston with her other daughter Elizabeth. Well, poor Helen died, so Mrs. McNichol decided to sell the house and stay in Boston with Elizabeth. So I was able to purchase the house. I made the changes necessary for about 30 patients in the beginning, and that was I made the changes necessary primarily on the first floor, and we had accommodations for about 30 patients in the beginning. The second floor had private rooms where patients could engage a private nurse if they desired. I was able to convince a number of prominent people in town to help pay for furnishing some of these rooms, among them Judge Gardner and the St. Croix Paper Company in Baileyville. Mrs. McNichol's daughter Elizabeth had married a wealthy Bostonian, and she paid to furnish her sister's old bedroom as a memorial to her. I outfitted the hospital with a complete laboratory, a Barnstead sterilizing plant, and all of that cost over $1,000 alone. The plant cost $1,000 alone, and other necessary appliances. There was an X-ray machine. That was one thing with which I was not satisfied, so I sat on immediately to get donations for one that was equal to to the hospital's other equipment. The initial cost for the hospital was $12,000, but we spent over $19,000 in the first year. That first summer we held a lawn party and raised $160 toward the purchase of an ambulance. We'd been paying $2 a trip for a rented one and thought it would be better to have our own. Private rooms cost from $15 to $21 per week, and ward rooms cost $12 per week. That covered everything including medicines, unless the patient required something special. Also, there was an extra $5 charge for the operating room and $3 charge for the delivery room. That first year we took in approximately $10,000 and we spent approximately $11,000, but we were pleased with this. We were drawing patients from far away as Aroostook and Penobscot counties, as well as from Charlotte County in New Brunswick. I'd hired Miss Sarah Hunter as the matron. She came highly recommended from the Bureau of Nurses in Boston, and Miss Lila Roach was in charge of the culinary department. The hospital had 3 nurses and an orderly, and we opened with 12 patients. Now, it was important that my hospital be a teaching hospital, so very soon I established a nurses training school. It was a 3-year course of instruction that required both oral and written examinations. Now understand this. The course included anatomy, physiology, practical nursing, dietetics, bacteriology, obstetrics, massage therapy, and chemistry, as well as lectures on eye, ear, nose, throat surgery, and tuberculosis. It was quite a comprehensive course of study for the day. But in 1918, there were 7 nurses in training, and 3 of them had rooms in my house on Calais Avenue and took their meals at the hospital. Nurses in training worked 12-hour shifts with 2 hours off a day, 5 hours off on Sundays, and 1 half-day off each week. As the training program grew, a nurse's residence was established first in a building at the back of the hospital, and later in 1941 at a house across the street from the hospital. By 1938, I realized that I couldn't operate the hospital forever, although you know we always think we can, but I knew I was beginning to think about retiring, and I was getting older. For a time, I contemplated closing the hospital, but I knew that would be a calamity for the city, so I began to rethink what could be done to save the hospital. Excuse me. Finally, I get over it. Finally, a plan was devised and we sold the hospital for $35,000, even though I had invested $175,000 in it. I wanted to ensure that Calais could continue to have a hospital, and luckily I was able to sell it to a newly formed organization under the Charities and Benevolent Act, run by a board of trustees. So it hopefully would continue for a long time, and I understand that it has. Well, of course, my life was not just my medical practice. I was involved in many civic organizations and professional groups. I was married in Baltimore back in the 1890s to my first wife, Estella Delaney, and we had 3 children. There was my son John, who you may remember was a dentist here in Calais for many years, and then we had 2 daughters who married and moved away. Estella, my wife, died in 1929, but I must say I didn't stay a widower too long. In 1930, the Chautauqua came to Calais, as it did each year, and I met a young woman, Hannah Harris from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who had come with the Chautauqua group. If you aren't familiar with Chautauqua, it was a traveling troupe that brought lectures, educational lectures, and entertainment to many small towns and cities. It was popular for many years. Well, we fell in love despite our substantial difference in ages. She was as young as my children, and I must admit it caused a bit of a stir in town. She being so much younger than I, and my wife only being dead for less than a year. Boy, did we give them something to talk about. Nonetheless, we were married that same year. I lived until 1948, when I passed away at my home on Calais Avenue. Of course, Hannah outlived me by nearly 40 years. My funeral was from the house, as was often done in those days, and I'm told there was a large group in attendance. the advertiser printed a long and very nice obituary. Allow me to share just a little bit of it with you. The large attendance of friends testified to the esteem in which Dr. Miner was held. The tribute of his pastor embodied his philosophy of life with praise for his long years of useful endeavor, his humanitarianism, and the courage and zeal with which he solved many problems confronting him. His friendliness and his zest for living brought him many friendships from all walks of life. Kind of touches my heart now. Of course, it also mentioned my medical accomplishments, which I think these few statements pleased me the most, and summed up what I would most like to be remembered for. Well, I think that about covers it for one afternoon. I'm not going to try to out-talk that Holmes down there, except I must tell you I had a very hard time finding where I belonged. You see, when I died, I was placed in a mausoleum, and today when I arrived, it was gone. I understand it deteriorated so badly that it had to be dismantled. So forgive me if I don't quite know where I am. And if some moonlight night you see me out here looking at headstones, you'll know what I'm up to really, is trying to figure out where I belong. It's time for me to say goodbye. Thank you all for coming, and let me tell you how much I enjoyed sharing this time with you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Dr. Miner. Before you go to the next place, you still have one more, right?
Yeah.
Before you go, I forgot to tell you something. As much as I talked, I forgot to tell you something. There's nothing to do with Dr. Holmes, really. It's just a bit of trivia. If you go back down to the two stones, one's Dr. Holmes and one is Vesta Holmes. I was Dr. Holmes. On Dr. Holmes' stone, it says, died March 1st. That's Patsy's birthday. On Vesta's stone, it says, died May 7th. That's my birthday.
There you go. See, I told you.